So a lot of stories, we start with this, as Shedeur Sanders was sliding, suddenly stories started to pop out from Jacina Anderson, Todd McShay, Jonathan Jones, NFL insider for CBS, stuff that wasn't out there as much pre-draft. I mean, we knew that legendary draft room. We could see that was a bit cringe. But when people were starting to explain, well, what happened? Well, stories started coming out that he sandbagged certain interviews or was brash. Bruce Feldman wrote an article that I read. He not only didn't compete at the Senior Bowl or NFL Scouting Combine, a former NFL quarterback coach Feldman spoke with Sunday Morning said, not surprising. The intel I was getting on Sanders was shocking. He had no self-awareness.
You know what's crazy? Deion Sanders has worked for literally every major sports network. ESPN, NFL Network, CBS. He's got friends everywhere in the media. But when it came to his son Shedeur's NFL draft, those same friends might have been his biggest enemy. Because here's the thing nobody's talking about. When you're that connected, when you're that loved by the media, sometimes people won't tell you the hard truth. And according to NFL insiders, that's exactly what happened. While Deion was out, they're demanding teams meet his terms. NFL executives were privately saying Shedeur had shocking lack of self-awareness. The media friends who should have warned him, they stayed silent. And it cost Shedeur millions. Look, I'm going to break this down for you because what happened to Shedeur Sanders in the NFL draft wasn't just about football, it was about betrayal. At the highest level. And I'm not talking about teams betraying him. I'm talking about the people closest to his family, the media insiders who had all the information but chose to keep quiet while watching a young man's career potentially go up in flames. So let's start with what we actually know. As draft day unfolded and Shedeur started sliding, stories began popping up from people like Jacina Anderson, Todd McShay, and Jonathan Jones, NFL insider for CBS. But here's what's messed up about this whole situation. This intel wasn't coming out before the draft when it could have actually helped the Sanders family. It was coming out after, when it was too late to do anything about it. We all saw that legendary draft room footage. You know the one I'm talking about. The Sanders family sitting there, cameras rolling, expecting Shedeur's name to be called. Early, the confidence, the expectation, the slow realization that something was very, very wrong. That footage wasn't just cringe, it was heartbreaking when you understand what was really happening behind the scenes. Because while that family was sitting there believing in their son's prospects, NFL teams were getting completely different information. According to reports that came out after the draft, Shedeur had apparently sandbagged certain interviews, came across as brash, and here's the kicker. Bruce Feldman wrote an article detailing how he not only didn't compete at the Senior Bowl or NFL Scouting Combine, but a former NFL quarterback coach told Feldman on Sunday Morning, not surprising. The intel I was getting on Sanders was shocking. He had no self-awareness. Now pause right there. Think about what that means. This isn't some random Twitter speculation. This is a former NFL quarterback coach, someone who knows talent, someone who's been in those rooms where decisions get made. And he's saying the intel on Shedeur was shocking and that he had no self-awareness. But here's where this story gets really dark. And this is where Deion's media connections become the villain in this story instead of the hero. According to Peter Schrager, who used to work at NFL Network and now works at ESPN, Deion has worked for so many media outlets and has so many friends in the NFL that nobody wanted to give him the truth. Your son's okay. Let that sink in for a minute. Nobody wanted to give him the truth. These people who Deion probably considers friends, people he's worked alongside for years, people who had access to the same information that NFL teams were getting, they all chose to stay silent rather than have an uncomfortable conversation with their friend.
Until mid to late March to say, okay, now anybody can draft my son. So now, was I surprised? Yes, Pittsburgh didn't have a quarterback in a division with Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. I mean, I don't know who their quarterback is. But Daniel Jeremiah, a former three-time scout on the NFL Network, made a very interesting point. Jeremiah is really good at what he does. He was quoted as saying that the one quarterback that he thought was similar to Shedeur Sanders was Kenny Pickett. And what Daniel Jeremiah said, well, they did Kenny Pickett and they got burned, and they may have looked at it and said, yeah, we've done that kind of quarterback before. Not a big arm, moves okay, decent.
And this brings us to something that NFL executives were apparently discussing behind closed doors, something that should have been communicated to the Sanders family long before draft day. According to Colin Cowherd, who spoke to an NFL executive, here's what that executive told him. If he doesn't go in the first 6 to 8 picks at the top of the second round, then people view him as a backup. But then came the real gut punch. I'm not sure how many teams want that circus in the building as a backup. Think about how brutal that assessment is. They're not just saying he's not starter material. They're saying he's too much of a distraction to even be a backup quarterback. And you know what? The executive brought up Tim Tebow as a comparison. Remember Tim Tebow? Celebrity backup, a mess in New York. Bill Belichick made a decision once Mac Jones beat him out in New England. They let Cam Newton go. The message was clear. Nobody wants a celebrity backup quarterback. But here's what makes this whole situation so frustrating. Where were Deion's media friends when this assessment was floating around NFL circles? Where were the people who supposedly cared about his family when teams were having these conversations? Because make no mistake, this information was out there. NFL insiders knew it. Media personalities knew it. And yet, somehow, the Sanders family seemed completely blindsided by how the draft unfolded. The timeline here is crucial to understand. Deion waited until mid to late March to say, okay, now anybody can draft my son. But by that point, teams had already formed their opinions. March and April, as Cowherd pointed out, are job interview months in the NFL. And what were teams hearing during those crucial months? That Deion was setting terms, that there were teams Shedeur wouldn't play for, that the family was making demands. Meanwhile, Shedeur himself was making statements that, in hindsight, probably didn't help his cause. At the NFL Combine, he said, "Words matter. People listen. If you ain't trying to change the franchise, the culture, don't get me." Now, there's confidence, and then there's, well, whatever that was. Teams listened, all right. They listened, and they decided they didn't want that energy in their building. But again, where were the media friends during all this? Where were the people who could have pulled Deion aside and said, hey, you might want to dial this back a little bit? Teams are getting concerned about the demands and the attitude. Instead, they stayed silent and watched it all unfold. The comparison that Daniel Jeremiah made was particularly telling. Jeremiah, a former 3-time scout who really knows what he's talking about, said the quarterback Shedeur reminded him most of was Kenny Pickett. And you know what Pittsburgh's experience with Kenny Pickett was? They got burned. So when they looked at Shedeur, they probably thought, yeah, we've done that kind of quarterback before. Not a big arm, moves okay, decent numbers. We're going to pass on that. This is where the story gets even more frustrating for the Sanders family. Pittsburgh doesn't have a quarterback in a division with Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. They needed a quarterback desperately. And yet, even they passed on Shedeur. That should have been a massive red flag to anyone paying attention. The intangibles issue is something that can't be overlooked here. In the NFL, if you're not an A-level prospect, and clearly Shedeur wasn't viewed that way, then you absolutely have to get the intangibles right. Look at guys like Dak Prescott, who's never thrown with an A-level arm, but was A++ with intangibles. Brock Purdy, small, not a great athlete, but A++ with intangibles. The reports suggest that people didn't like some of Shedeur's intangibles, and in a position where leadership and character matter so much, that's devastating. But here's what really gets me angry about this whole situation. Deion Sanders legendarily sandbagged interviews during his own playing career. He bragged about sandbagging interviews. But Deion was an A++ prospect, arguably the best cornerback of all time. When you're that level of talent, you can get away with attitude because your ability speaks for itself. When you're not at that level, when you're A, B, or C prospect like most quarterbacks in this draft class, you can't afford to make the same mistakes your father made. And this is where those media friends really failed the Sanders family. Someone should have explained this to them. Someone should have said, look, Deion, what worked for you isn't going to work for Shedeur because he's not in the same tier of prospect that you were. But apparently, nobody wanted to have that conversation. The analogy that was made during Colin Cowherd's staff meeting is perfect. It's almost like you're a young actor who's only ever been in your dad's movies, and then you interview with other directors to finally not be in one of your dad's movies, and you kind of lack self-awareness and turn some people off. That's exactly what happened here. The noise factor can't be underestimated either. As Cowherd pointed out, noise scares a lot of teams, especially at the quarterback position. The discussions about quarterbacks are always different than discussions about other positions. When NFL people talk about other positions, they talk about toughness, productivity, speed, vertical. About leadership. Will guys follow him over a hill? Is he a foxhole guy? The conversation completely changes. And when you have all this noise around a family making demands, setting terms, sandbagging interviews, it raises questions about all those intangible qualities that matter so much at the quarterback position. The Cleveland situation is particularly interesting and might actually support Shedeur's case a little bit. There are reports that the GM and coach didn't want to draft him. They'd already drafted a quarterback. But Jimmy Haslam, the owner, stepped in like he did with Deshaun Watson. Andrew Berry's reaction when explaining the pick was telling. Once, it got to a point where it felt like it was at a pretty steep discount. We just felt like, especially relative to the alternative ways that we could use the selection, this made the most sense. That reaction wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, asterisk. And if you watch that draft room footage from Cleveland, their reaction was stoic, to be honest. Not the most excited-looking draft room when they selected him. But here's what bothers me most about this entire situation. Cam Ward was indisputably viewed as the best quarterback prospect, maybe close to an A prospect, but everybody else was viewed as B and C prospects. In that situation, every other quarterback needed to absolutely nail the intangibles part of the evaluation. And according to multiple reports, Shedeur didn't do that. The media friends who stayed silent, who didn't want to hurt Deion's feelings or damage their relationship with him, they did more harm than any enemy could have done. Because at least an enemy would have been honest. At least an enemy would have given them information they could have used to adjust their approach. Think about how different this story could have been if someone had pulled Deion aside in February and said, "Look, teams are getting concerned about the demands you're making. Shedeur needs to nail these interviews because his arm talent isn't elite level. Maybe dial back the circus a little bit and let his football ability speak for itself." But that conversation never happened. Instead, they all watched from the sidelines as a young man's draft stock plummeted, as his family sat in that draft room getting more confused and frustrated by the hour, as millions of dollars in potential earnings slipped away. This is why the media's role in this story is so important to understand. These weren't objective observers reporting on events as they unfolded. These were people with relationships, people with access, people who chose comfort over truth when it mattered most. And now, as all this information comes out after the fact, when it can't help anyone, we're supposed to just accept that this is how the business works? That friends don't tell friends hard truths because it might be uncomfortable? The Sanders family deserved better. Shedeur deserved better. They deserved friends who would risk an uncomfortable conversation to prevent a public embarrassment. They deserved honesty when it could have made a difference, not posthumous analysis when it's too late to matter. The next time you see Deion Sanders on your TV screen, working for one of these networks, remember this story. Remember how his so-called friends in the media watched his son's draft stock crater and chose to stay silent rather than speak up. Because that's not friendship. That's betrayal dressed up in a suit and tie. What do you think? Should media personalities be more honest with their friends even when it hurts? Or is it not their job to give career advice? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what really happens behind the scenes in sports, hit that subscribe button. Because we're just getting started, asterisk.